the deal is done, and the devil comes to reap your soul. The consequence has arrived. This is depression. You can't talk your way out of this one. There is no one left to make a deal with. You are all alone without hope. The 2010s was a rather pessimistic era.
Here in this darkness that I lay, depression heavy in its way.
While there has been Zoomer nostalgia for this era arising, it should be noted that this nostalgia is mostly for the very early portion of the decade, which still has residue from the bargaining era. Things like Minecraft and PewDiePie come to mind.
How's it going, bros? My name is
By and large, it was a rather negative decade. The genre of fiction I'd most associate with the 2010s is post-apocalypse stories.
This is it, the apocalypse.
Most especially zombie media. While zombie media was fairly popular even in the 2000s, the zombie stories of the bargaining era were almost exclusively comedies, such as Shaun of the Dead.
Oh my god. She's so drunk.
Or Zombieland.
No! Is that how you say hello? Where you come from?
Oh my god. Oh my god, I can't believe I shot Bill Murray.
Moving into the 2010s, you had the popularity of the series The Walking Dead at its height.
Steady. It's just a few, nothing we can't outrun.
And The Last of Us video game, which was a huge success.
I struggled for a long time with surviving. And no matter what, you keep finding something to fight for.
Zombie media was now taken seriously. The topic of zombies no longer evoked laughter, but seemed a little too real. The American dream wasn't just dead, it was undead. The corpse being paraded around in an attempt to convince people it was still alive. Zombie media was really the only original content from this depression stage. This was a decade jam-packed, full of sequels and remakes. This is the exact opposite of the shock stage of the 70s, where creativity was booming and new things were abundant everywhere. The 2010s was stagnation. People were too depressed to create anything new, to the point that even people who had jobs in creative fields were merely going through the motions in order to produce lackluster blockbusters, generic, boring music, and by-the-numbers video games. This was a time where either no effort was being put into these projects, or the effort was being put into actively making the product awful. It would seem that between the 70s and the early 2000s, there was vigor to the media of those decades.
For Frodo.
Whereas the 2010s just felt soulless.
It's time for the Jedi to end.
All the life force had been drained from society. Sure, there are some fantastic works made during the Depression era, but these are few and far between. For every great thing, like Dark Souls, there was 30 or 40 Ghostbusters 2016s.
Forgot about my new toys. Let's go.
It was a dark time. The zombie media of the early 2010s certainly reflected the Depression zeitgeist. People were soulless zombies, husks of their former selves. The party had ended. Nothing was fun anymore. Society had basically given up, and people did the bare minimum, which was a consistent theme in these zombie stories, striving for nothing higher than mere survival. People weren't living, they were just surviving, and this is reflected by this zombie media. Contrasting with the bargaining stage, which still had some hope, the Depression era was hopeless. Even adult cartoons, which in the early 2000s were beacons of cheer and hope,
We're back, baby!
were replaced by depressing shows like Rick and Morty.
Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's gonna die. Come watch TV.
And BoJack Horseman. Even comedy was not spared as far as having a depression theme was concerned.
Listen, Morty, I hate to break it to you, but what people call love is just a chemical reaction that compels animals to breed.
Video games were all about survival, and music became rather minimalistic. Everything became pretty far removed from the dream of the 80s denial. Now, everything was a nightmare.
Your tragic fate is looking so
Because of this nightmare, nostalgia was ever present, and although the specter of the 80s haunts Americanized cultures in every single decade, and still does to this day, I suspect that the 2010s Depression era was the peak of this 80s nostalgia. It really was everywhere throughout the decade, getting stuck in the past and longing for better times with these pale imitations. As much as I hate The Last Jedi, I have to admit that I resonate with Kylo Ren's meta-commentary on letting the past die.
Let the past die. Kill it, if you have to.
And how we are still holding on when we shouldn't.
No, you're still holding on! Let go!
The American empire was not striking back in the 2010s. It was on the decline. Patriotism, in the way that it existed in the denial era, was at an all-time low in the Depression stage. People couldn't even pretend to have enthusiasm for the regime anymore. The only enthusiasm that existed during this period was a nostalgic reverence for better times, or a longing for a future collapse, so we could start over. In a way, the world did in fact end in 2012, just not in quite the literal sense some expected it to. Everyone was just waiting for something to happen. This decade was like one long loading screen. It was purgatory, an endless sea of gray. Everything was dull and disheartening. Everyone was hollow. The 2010s was a negative charged decade, much like the 90s. However, there was no drive to do something about it. Like the anger era, there was no illusion that the dream could be resurrected.
Everybody betrayed me. I fed up with this world.
2015 was a lot different than Back to the Future Part 2 had predicted.
The future.
The only thing it seems to have gotten right was the endless sequels. That part came true. However, I find it interesting that Rick and Morty strongly pays homage to Back to the Future. I'm sure this will be a shocking revelation to literally no one, but these characters are supposed to resemble Doc and Marty, even down to the similarities of their names. But whereas Doc was enthusiastic and optimistic about the future and science and progress,
Your future hasn't been written yet. No one's has. Your future is whatever you make it.
Rick is an alcoholic nihilist who only reveals more horror and disappointment the more that he delves into things.
So what if the most meaningful day of your life was a simulation operating at minimum capacity?
Often to the disillusionment of everyone around him. Rick's purpose is essentially to burst everyone else's bubble and make them miserable like he is.
Listen, Morty, I hate to break it to you, but what people call love is just a chemical reaction that compels animals to breed. Break the cycle, Morty. Rise above. Focus on science.
Misery loves company, as they say, and he strives to make sure everyone else has given up hope like he has. Doc and Rick are almost complete opposites. However, it's interesting that even this show can't seem to let go of 80s nostalgia. It is that pervasive. Nostalgia is common during depression. I think it's safe to say that when one is happy, they aren't going to be reminiscing about happier times. If one is happy, they are in the moment. Even if one is angry, they are focused on the future, on trying to change things going forward. It is only sadness that reflects on the past, that looks in a backward direction. Depression often involves looking back on what was lost. Many may think that this is where the journey ends. After all, how can depression be a cope? Surely that's as real as it gets. I hate to break it to you, but depression is in fact yet another cope. The reason for this is largely because of this nostalgia. Depression is a time for reflection. Reflection, just like a mirror. Self-reflection. The depression stage is quite self-absorbed, especially when you compare it to the other stages. Denial is complete involvement in society's vision. Anger is working with others in order to get things done. And bargaining is making a deal with someone. All of these previous stages require an other, someone outside of yourself. However, depression is a solitary experience. Babe, you better not be romanticizing your melancholic solitude again. It may sound a bit strange, but there is a smug self-satisfaction that comes with depression. That you have figured it all out, or are better than other people. Need I bring up Rick Sanchez again? Depression allows self-stagnation. Since nothing matters and nothing can be done, you are liberated from trying at all.
Help me! Help me! I'm too lazy to escape!
You can just sit there, above it all, and look down upon all the silly fools who are still trying to do things. Another way depression can be a cope is when you wallow in your own self-pity. One can become rather solipsistic and think that nothing exists outside of themselves. At least in the bargaining stage, one had the decency to put on a fake smile. But someone in the depression stage simply has no shame. They put it all out there for everyone to see. In conclusion, depression can be very self-centered. I know that this is a very harsh criticism. I don't say this lightly. I say it partly as a self-critique, as I have dealt with depression myself. As someone whose teenage and young adult years were in the 2010s, I have spent most of my life, so far, swimming in these waters, living in this milieu of disillusionment. Many of my peers, and even many of my close friends in the past, have exhibited these traits, and it is something that has plagued my generation thoroughly, that being the very late millennial / early zoomer demographic. I have been criticizing all the generations in this series, so this is where I go after zoomers. Zoomers were late to the party. They missed the good times, so to speak. The older ones just caught the tail end of this enjoying the moment lifestyle and didn't really get much of a taste of it the way that millennials did. And the younger zoomers had it even worse. The 2020 epidemic socially stunted the development of Zoomers, who, let's face it, already were pretty socially stunted. If millennials had arrested development, the development of Zoomers wasn't just arrested, it was put into solitary confinement. Not only have many Zoomers never been to a party, a lot of them don't even have friends. This isolation that Zoomers have undergone is pretty alien to prior generations. This isn't to say that Boomers are all extroverts and Zoomers are mostly introverts. This isn't about personal preference. Even the more extroverted Zoomers spend most of their time scrolling on their phones and have very few bonds with others. But I assure you, this is not one of those self-help videos telling Zoomers to put down their phones and go outside to touch grass. In fact, I think one problem Zoomers have is that they spend all day watching self-help videos and patting themselves on the back for doing so. Zoomers have the personality of that guy in the corner of the party meme. They think they themselves have unlocked the mysteries of the universe because they discovered that going to the gym exists. In a way, Zoomers are almost the complete opposite of millennials, but this isn't necessarily a good thing. If millennials indulged their vices and were ceaseless hedonists looking for their next fix, Zoomers pride themselves on abstaining from these practices and engaging in forms of asceticism. They think of themselves as the Giga Chad because they work out. They think of themselves as the Sigma male because they are on the grind set. Zoomers are self-repressed narcissists who use self-improvement as a way to stroke their own egos. No one cares that you lift weights. No one cares that you are overworking yourself as a wage slave. Literally no one, absolutely no one cares that you are participating in NoFap. You can stop preaching about it. The reason Zoomers are not pleasure seekers like millennials were is simply because factors outside of their control made it simply impossible to maintain that former lifestyle. Zoomers missed the party. The well had ran dry by the time they came around. It is easy to resist temptation when there is no temptation to resist. It makes sense. Zoomers would say sour grapes to all that millennial degeneracy when they never even had access to that degeneracy in the first place. Zoomers are condemned to be Sisyphus pushing the boulder uphill for eternity, and one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Zoomers tell themselves that pushing this boulder makes them a Giga Chad Sigma male because otherwise this meaningless effort and weight of this rock would be too much to bear. They must all be a Ryan Gosling character and be nostalgic for times they never lived in, particularly the Roman Empire. All of this indicates just how depressed and repressed Zoomers are. And since Zoomers are perhaps more self-aware than prior generations, deep down, they may already know this. I know this is a brutal truth, and I don't mean to kick Zoomers when they are already down. I mean, I am a Zoomer myself, even if I am one of the older ones, so I can definitely relate and empathize. Despite being on the cusp of both generations, I've always related to Zoomers more than millennials. I know it might sound like I'm talking more about today's world rather than the one between 2010 and 2019, but there isn't a hard cutoff to these decades, and we're still living in that residue of the Depression era, even if we are finally leaving it behind. The 2010s is a difficult decade to discuss because it was so boring. The 2000s was a goldmine of memes, and I don't think that I could possibly top that video with this one. My references to the 2010s post-apocalypse theme are far more limited and less entertaining. Pop culture just sucked. I think that the theme for this decade is far more obvious this time around and far less interesting to explore. Maybe I'm just sick of the 2010s after spending most of my life inside it. Or maybe many of these depression themes go under my radar since they just seem normal to me. However, if there is one work of art that I think showcases the brilliant heights even the Depression era can reach, that would be my favorite video game, Dark Souls. In contrast to the superhero theme of the early 2000s, Dark Souls is not a game that makes you feel like a superhero. Far from empowering, it makes you feel powerless.
Well, what do we have here? You must be a new arrival. Well, you're not the first, but there's no salvation here.
You are no hero. In fact, you have no real purpose in this world. The world is cruel, confusing, and discouraging. Dark Souls is also very quiet and allows for vast quantities of self-reflection. I know that I was just talking trash about the self-absorbed nature of Zoomers, but this is also the strength of the depression phase. That being solitude and finding resilience, even in a world that is against you. Not needing to bargain or attempting to take the easy way out, but finding the inner fortitude to push on, even without external motivation. Dark Souls captures the best essence of this era and the highest peaks that can be attained even at some of the lowest points of our journey. Even at rock bottom, we can have a grand adventure. Persevering to the end is a triumph in and of itself. Depression can be a tough adversary, and not everyone can endure it, but those that do are stronger for it. But it must be said that there is no delusion that you are a hero anymore.
I'm the bad guy. Duh.
With some of the boss fights, it can be difficult to argue that you are in the right, especially Sif the Wolf, who is simply a guard dog preventing you from grave robbing. However, you must do what you have to do. Upon your self-reflection, you may be horrified at what you have done just to keep going. You are not the savior of this land. You are just another participant in this cruel game. It's ambiguous if the ends justify the means. And even though there are two endings to the game, they are not conveniently labeled the good or bad endings like many 2000s video games. The endings are ultimately up to your own interpretation. It is beyond good and evil. It is following your will, nothing more. This shedding of morality, whether in a triumphant sense like Dark Souls or in a degrading Rick and Morty style, is what happens during the depression stage of the 2010s. We have reached utter nihilism. So what follows? The testing stage is what follows, where people are truly tested to their breaking point. And between depression and testing, we see a rejection of playing the hero and an embracing of the villain role. We can no longer LARP as if we are the heroes. We must admit that we are the baddies. Not that we are actually even evil exactly, but that we will be perceived as such according to the denial era regime's view of the world. This is inevitable. Mere survival will be deemed evil. You either die the hero or live long enough to become the villain.
You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
The 2010s was the depressing realization that this process was occurring. The transition from hero to villain.
Sometimes reasonable men must do unreasonable things.
This time, we are not simply making a deal with the devil, we are becoming the devil himself.
I am the danger. A guy opens his door and gets shot, and you think that of me? No. I am the one who knocks.
No half measures. People would retreat into their denial fantasies or become mindless zombies in order to overlook this process occurring. But even the depression phase must end. The inaction of the 2010s had to finish eventually. I will contrast this with the anger era. In the 90s, there was a yearning for change. The testing phase is a bit different. It is reluctant. It does not want to take action. It absolutely needs to take action. As bittersweet as solitude can be, even this luxury is no longer granted. You can no longer stay in self-pity and nostalgia. You will be forced to do something, even with no hope whatsoever for a better tomorrow. It is done out of necessity, a necessary evil. Our occulturation continues.